Detroit, Michigan, the year 1954. The neighborhood is still dark, with the sound of a bus echoing in the distance. Beneath the yellow light, a wooden table holds a can of luncheon meat, crackers, bread, and a roll of wax paper with its edges worn. She prepares a packed lunch, waiting for it to be opened when the break whistle blows. She pulls the recipe box from the shelf. The lid opens slightly, revealing pencil-written recipe cards and corners of paper stained with grease. Her hands remember the thickness of each spread, the color of the skillet, the taste of the pickles, and how cool the eggs should be. But she isn't just packing a lunch. She's wrapping up the entire afternoon inside it. Recipe number 30 is luncheon meat with crackers. Recipe number 24 includes pickles and salt pork. Recipe number 18 is made from whitefish. Recipe number 5 brings to mind the taste of crab. Recipe number 1 is a slice of cold meatloaf beneath a thin streak of ketchup. If those old kitchens still mean something to you, subscribe to Old American Kitchen. Every week, one recipe card will be opened. Tonight, the recipe box opens. Pull your chair a little closer. 30 lunches begin with recipe number 30, canned meat, saltine crackers, and the factory break room, Detroit, Michigan, 1954. Its morning in the home of an automobile factory worker's family began before daylight reached the windows. Water ran steadily into the enamel sink. A knife blade lightly touched a china plate. Wax paper was pulled from the roll with a dry, crisp, familiar tear. She looked at the things laid out on the table and divided them into portions that fit neatly in the hand. Lunch had to be opened quickly, wrapped securely, and eaten on a wooden bench in the break room, amid the sound of shift whistles and the metallic echoes from the assembly line. The first 5 dishes left that Detroit kitchen together. A small can could travel farther than the kitchen itself. Eat number 30. Canned meat spread on crackers. The small can sat quietly in a coat pocket until the noon whistle sounded. In 1954, in Detroit, a can of potted meat, a few crackers, and a little onion or mustard cost about 18 cents. That was enough to make a lunch that could be eaten right beside a tin lunchbox. She held the can in one hand and turned the can opener around the rim until the lid sprang up with a faint click. The smooth meat was scraped onto a plate and spread evenly over each cracker. If a piece of onion remained, she sliced it into almost transparent pieces. A thin streak of mustard was added to give the saltiness a little bite. The crackers were arranged in pairs inside wax paper, knitted closely together, so their corners would knock against one another less during the bus ride. In the factory break room, the meal required very little time. The worker could hold each pair of crackers between fingers that still carried the smell of machine oil, chew quickly, and return to the line before the next whistle. The small can did everything it needed to do. To number 29. Batter-fried Spam. The golden brown slice of Spam carried the sound of the frying pan from the kitchen all the way to the break room. In 1954, a portion of Spam, flour, 1 egg, and frying fat for several slices cost about 27 cents. For a Detroit factory family, the thin coating made the familiar canned meat feel more substantial inside the lunchbox. She cut the Spam into slices about as thick as a finger. Flour was sprinkled onto a shallow plate, while the egg was beaten in an enamel bowl until the yolk blended into the white. Each slice of meat was dipped into the egg, coated with flour, and lowered into the hot fat. A sharp sizzle broke out as soon as the coating touched the pan. The edges of the meat gradually darkened, the crust became speckled, and the rich, salty aroma spread all the way to the doorframe. She turned each slice until both sides were golden, then placed them on paper so the excess oil could drain away. Once they had cooled slightly, the slices were wrapped in separate portions so the crust would stay firm. Spam had appeared in many kitchen cupboards during the war years and remained in working families' homes afterward. In this kitchen, the sound of sizzling fat brought the meal to life. Number 28. Canned sardine and raw onion sandwich. The small can of fish opened with a smell strong enough to cut through bus exhaust and machine dust. Detroit in 1954, canned sardines, white bread, and one small onion cost a total of about 16 cents. She opened the can and tilted her wrist slightly so the oil remained inside. Each fish was lifted with a fork and laid lengthwise across a slice of soft bread. The raw onion was sliced thinly and scattered in a light layer so its sharpness accompanied the saltiness of the fish. When the second slice of bread was pressed down, the oil gradually soaked into the white crumb, leaving a dark ring around the edges of the fish. The sandwich was wrapped separately. She smoothed the wax paper flat and folded the edges tightly together so the smell of fish stayed contained within its own parcel. At break time, the raw onion awakened the tongue in the middle of a long day, filled with the sounds of hammers, presses, and shoes dragging across the factory floor. The smell of fish lingered for a long time. Eat number 27, pecan grease crackers. Beside the stove stood a jar holding bacon grease that had cooled and solidified after earlier meals. In 1954, flour saved grease, salt, and a little sugar for one batch of crackers cost about 9 cents. She scooped out a spoonful of cloudy white grease and worked it into the flour until the mixture broke into small crumbs. Salt and sugar were sprinkled in by hand. She added water, mixed until the dough came together, and rolled it into a thin layer on the tall top. The knife cut the dough into small pieces, even enough to fit neatly inside a paper bag. When the crackers went into the oven, the mild, smoky smell of the bacon grease returned to the kitchen. The edges turned golden, while the surfaces became dry and speckled with tiny brown spots. She waited for the crackers to cool and then stacked them, sometimes adding a piece of cheese or a remaining slice of canned meat. The grease left over from breakfast continued working through lunch. The old grease still held its flavor. Eaten number 26, peanut butter and bacon sandwich. 2 slices of bread held enough energy for the afternoon shift. Detroit in 1954, white bread, peanut butter, a few slices of bacon, and a little lettuce cost about 26 cents. She fried the bacon first, listening to the grease crackle around the curling edges of the meat. The bacon slices were lifted from the pan and placed on paper to drain. Peanut butter was spread evenly over both slices of bread, thick enough to hold the filling in place while remaining easy to bite through. The bacon was placed between them while it was still warm. If any lettuce remained, she added a thin layer, providing a cool crunch beside the richness and smoky flavor. She gently pressed the sandwich together, folded the wax paper tightly at both ends, and placed it in the bag. For someone who rode the bus early in the morning, stood beside a machine all day, and had only a few minutes for a break, the meal was both compact and sturdy. One slice of bread carried an entire afternoon shift. The Detroit kitchen closed with the sound of wrapping paper being smoothed flat and an empty can being placed beside the sink. But in the Kentucky mining country, lunch had to withstand coal dust, a long journey, and many hours inside a tin lunchbox. The box could not hold warmth for very long, but the care placed inside it still followed the miner all the way down into the earth. Cabbage, boiled eggs, the miner's lunch, Pail, Harlan County, Kentucky. The year 1951. While the Appalachian mountainsides are still wrapped in darkness, footsteps already cross the wooden floor of the small kitchen. The water in the kettle begins to tremble softly. The lid of the pickle jar touches the tabletop. The tin lunch pail sits open beneath the dim lamp, beside a roll of wax paper, a few hard-boiled eggs, and the leftover grits that have cooled since the day before. She prepares lunch before the mine whistle echoes through the valley. The food has to withstand the rough road, coal dust, and long hours inside the cold lunch pail. The tin pail doesn't hold warmth for very long. It keeps a man standing. Item number 25. Preed cabbage with bacon fat sandwich. The cabbage from the backyard garden is brought inside while the leaves are still cool with the morning chill. In Harlan County in the year 1951, cabbage, bacon fat, bread or biscuits, and a little vinegar cost about 15 cents. She separates the leaves, slices them into thin shreds, and drops them into the hot bacon fat. A sizzling sound rises around the edges of the cabbage. The cabbage shrinks, changing from pale green to tender and glossy, carrying the smoky aroma left behind in the bacon fat. Salt, pepper, and a splash of vinegar are added just as the cabbage reaches the right tenderness. She spoons the filling onto a plate and lets the heat soften before placing it between slices of bread or inside a biscuit. The bread is pressed gently on both sides to keep the strands of cabbage tucked neatly inside. By break time in the mine, the tang of the vinegar keeps the bread from tasting too dry, while the bacon fat leaves a trace of warmth on the tip of the tongue. The cabbage gives the sandwich its strength. Teat number 24. Pickled cucumbers with salt pork. A jar of cold pickles can make a piece of salt pork feel lighter in the stifling tunnel. That year, cucumbers, vinegar, sugar, salt, and a few slices of salt pork cost about 17 cents altogether. The night before, she slices the cucumbers thinly, layers them into a jar, and pours vinegar mixed with salt and a little sugar over the top. Overnight, the edges of the cucumber slices soften while the centers keep their crisp bite. In the morning, she lays the salt pork into the skillet until the fat slowly renders and the edges begin to curl. The pork is wrapped separately in paper. The pickles stay inside a small jar with the lid screwed on tightly, keeping the vinegar from soaking into the bread. When the jar is opened, the sharp scent spreads faster than the smell of coal clinging to a work shirt. A cold pickle slice alongside a piece of salty pork makes lunch easier to eat. The vinegar keeps lunch awake. Pint number 20. Hard-boiled eggs with a small packle of salt. When the mine whistle blows, 2 eggs and 1 biscuit are enough for a meal. In Harlan County in the year 1951, that lunch, together with a small packet of salt, it cost about 11 cents. She usually boils several eggs at the beginning of the week. Once the water gently bubbles around the shells, the eggs are lifted out, cooled, and kept in an enamel bowl in the coolest corner of the kitchen. Every morning she takes 2 eggs, wraps them in paper, and twists a pinch of salt into a smaller piece of paper. The biscuit is placed beside them, just enough to keep everything from rolling around inside the lunch pail. The miner can tap the eggs against the edge of the pail, peel away the shell piece by piece, then sprinkle on the salt with his fingertips. The whites are cool, the yolks rich and crumbly, and the salt melts quickly on the tongue. In the middle of a long shift, that lunch needs no ceremony. A pinch of salt is enough to warm a memory. Item number 20. Grits cakes made from leftovers. Yesterday morning's corn grits returned in a firmer form. Leftover grits, bacon fat, and a little molasses or salt cost about 11 cents in the year 1951. The night before, she spreads the cooled grits onto a plate, smooths the surface flat, and leaves them overnight to set. In the morning, she cuts them into thick slices and places them into the hot bacon fat. As the cakes touch the skillet, they give off a gentle crackling sound. The outside gradually turns golden, while the inside stays soft and full of the aroma of corn. Some slices are sprinkled with salt. Others receive a few drops of dark molasses that slowly run across the surface. She waits until the cakes have cooled before wrapping them, so the steam won't soften the crust. That's how breakfast keeps working long after noon arrives. Morning keeps walking into the afternoon. Item number 21. Fried apple hand pie served cold, dried apples from the autumn return inside a small pie wrapped in brown paper. In the year 1951, dried apples, flour, sugar, cinnamon, and frying fat for a small batch cost about 14 cents. She places the apples into a pot with a little water, sugar, and cinnamon. The dried apple pieces absorb the liquid, become soft again, and fill the kitchen with a warm, sweet aroma. The dough is rolled into small circles. The apple filling is placed in the center, and the edges are sealed by pressing them together with the tines of a fork. The pies touch the hot fat, the crust puffs gently and turns golden brown. She lifts them out one by one, places them on paper, and waits until they have cooled completely before wrapping them. Deep underground or out in the cold fields, one small pie carrying the scent of cinnamon and last autumn's apples can make the lunch break seem shorter. Last year's apples still carry autumn. 5 recipes of Harlan County pass through vinegar, salt, bacon fat, and dried apples. Leaving the mining region for Akron, the question in the kitchen changes direction once again. What was left over from last night, and what kind of lunch could morning hands turn it into for the next day? Cold chicken, leftover rice, and the lunches that brought back tomorrow Akron, Ohio, 1960. From the Kentucky mining country, the story moved toward the rubber factories, where the smell of industrial smoke often clung to workers' clothing before they returned home to the dinner table. On this family's kitchen shelf, the recipe box appeared for the second time. The corners of several cards had softened from grease. One card read cold chicken, another read rice and egg. At the bottom was a shorter note, save the drippings. She read those lines at a glance and set the box aside. Her hands already knew the rest. In the Akron kitchen, leftovers were a lunch waiting to be given a name. When they returned to the table, they always took a different form. Item number 20, cold chicken and mayonnaise bread rolls. The chicken from Sunday night still rested on a covered plate, its white meat firm after a night in the cold. In 1960, in Akron, the leftover chicken, mayonnaise, white bread, and a little pepper for this dish cost about 24 cents. She used her fingertips to pull the meat from the bones, tore it into small shreds, and placed it in a bowl. Just enough mayonnaise was mixed in to bind the chicken together. A little pepper fell over the filling, sometimes accompanied by a few slices of celery left in the refrigerator. The sound of the fork touching the side of the bowl was dry and steady in the quiet morning. She lightly rolled each slice of bread to soften the crumb, spread the filling in a thin layer, and rolled it tightly from the outer edge. Each roll was cut in half and placed snugly beside the other in wax paper so it would hold its shape on the way to the factory. Sunday dinner moved into Monday without having to repeat itself exactly. The old chicken had a new shape. Number 19. Fried rice with soy sauce. The cold rice from the night before fell into the pan with a soft patter. In Akron in 1960, leftover rice, 1 egg, onion, soy sauce, and a little fat cost a total of about 17 cents. She let the pan heat before adding the rice. The dry grains gradually separated beneath the back of the spoon, slid through the thin layer of fat, and began to crackle. The egg was broken into the center of the pan. The yolk burst and wrapped around each grain as she stirred quickly with a turn of her wrist. Finely chopped onion was sprinkled in just as the smell of egg began to rise. Finally, a stream of dark soy sauce ran around the edge of the pan, turning the sides of the rice grains brown and giving them a deeper saltiness. Steam rose with the smell of onion, egg, and the bottom of the pan just beginning to crisp. Only a few minutes earlier, it had still been last night's rice. Now the sound of the pan had brought it back to life. Item number 18, cold fish cakes. The remaining white fish was placed on the cutting board beside a bowl of mashed potatoes and a handful of breadcrumbs. That year, the 4 ingredients of fish, potatoes, egg, and breadcrumbs cost about 22 cents. She pulled the fish into small pieces, running her fingertips along the flesh to find any bones that remained. The mashed potatoes were added, softening the smell of the fish and making the mixture more tender. 1 egg held everything together, while the breadcrumbs were sprinkled in, a little at a time, until the filling was firm enough. She scooped each portion into her palm, pressed it gently, and shaped it into a round cake. When the cakes touched the pan, the fat bubbled around their edges. The undersides turned golden, the crusts gradually firmed, and a light roasted fish aroma rose from them. The cakes were left to cool before being wrapped. By then, the crusts were firmer, the centers more substantial, and the cakes easier to hold during the break. The palm of her hand gave the fish a new shape. Item number 17. Toast spread with beef drippings. In the small bowl was a layer of beef drippings that had solidified after the Sunday roast. In Akron in 1960, bread, the saved drippings, salt, pepper, and a little vinegar cost about 12 cents. She placed the bread in the pan until both sides were lightly dried. While the bread was still hot, beef drippings were spread over it with a knife, slowly melting and soaking into the small holes in the crumb. The smell of browned onions and roasted meat from the previous meal returned with the heat. She sprinkled on pepper, added a few grains of salt, and then let 1 drop of malt vinegar fall onto the bread to give the richness a stopping point. The slice was cut in half while its surface still gleamed beneath the kitchen light. The drippings had left the roast platter, but the flavor of the family meal remained intact. Sundae was still on the bread. Eating number 16, sweet potato biscuits with cured meat. The sweet potatoes were brought up from the cool storage area, their skin still carrying a little dry soil. In 1960, the sweet potatoes, flour, lard, and a few slices of cured meat for this dish cost about 16 cents. She mashed the cooked sweet potatoes until the orange flesh became smooth, then mixed it into the biscuit dough with the lard. The dough was patted with the palm of her hand, folded and cut into thick rounds. In the oven, the tops rose slightly, turned golden, and released the deep, sweet aroma of the potatoes. Once the biscuits had cooled, she split each one and placed a thin slice of cured meat between the halves. The sweet potato kept the biscuits moist for many hours. Meat provided the saltiness needed by someone standing beside a machine through a long shift. A soft biscuit carried a long day. The 5 Akron dishes carried chicken, rice, fish, beef drippings, and sweet potatoes into the following day. But farther east, many lunchboxes held foods that had crossed the Atlantic. They arrived with immigrant families, preserving old methods before finding a new place in American working-class kitchens. Hard cheese, pork pies, and the immigrant foods that traveled in coat pockets, Scranton, Pennsylvania, the year 1938. Foods that once crossed the Atlantic now rest on the kitchen table of an American working-class family. Outside the window, the early morning mist hangs over the rooftops near the mining district. The sound of heavy boots crossing the porch, the snap of a lunch pail opening, and the smell of damp coal drift into the room on the breeze. The grandmother in this kitchen lives among miners and factory workers of English, Irish, German, and Polish descent. Lunch has to be sturdy, able to survive a long trip and keep its shape after hours in a coat pocket. On the table sit a block of hard cheese, a jar of pickles, rolled oats, a few sausage links, and a chilled piece of head cheese resting on an enamel plate. The next 5 recipes belong to Scranton in the year 1938. These immigrant foods endured because they could travel in a coat pocket. Item number 15. Hard cheese with pickles. A piece of hard cheese was once enough to carry a miner through a long shift underground. In Scranton in the year 1938, hard cheddar, pickles, and rye bread for one meal cost about 19 cents. She places the block of cheese on the cutting board and slices it into thick pieces just large enough to hold between 2 fingers. The blade passes through the firm cheese with a dry sound, leaving tiny golden crumbs on the wooden surface. She opens the pickle jar and uses a clean fork to lift each pickle onto a separate sheet of paper. Clear vinegar drips away, carrying the scent of dill, salt, and the cool storage cellar. The rye bread is cut into thick slices, its crumb dense and slightly moist. She wraps the cheese well away from the pickles, so the vinegar won't soak into the bread before the lunch break. When it's time to eat, the miner takes a bite of cheese, a bite of pickle, then a little bread. The sharpness cuts through the richness, waking the tongue in the midst of coal dust and the heavy air underground. The vinegar brightens the cheese. Item number 14. English-style pork hand pie. The small round pie sits securely inside a cloth napkin, compact enough to carry down into the mine. In the year 1938, ground pork, pastry flour, lard, and seasonings for several small pies cost about 31 cents altogether. She mixes the ground pork with salt and pepper using a wooden spoon, pressing the filling until the seasoning is evenly worked through. The pastry is rolled thicker than a sweet pie crust, sturdy enough to hold the meat through the long journey. She places the filling in the center, folds the dough up around it, and seals the edges firmly with her fingertips. Its rough crimps leave traces of flour on her skin. In the oven, the pork fat begins to bubble gently beneath the crust. The aroma of pepper and baking pastry spreads through the kitchen, mingling with the warmth drifting from the oven door. The pies are removed when the crust turns a light golden brown. She waits until the filling has cooled and become firm before wrapping each pie in a cloth, allowing the steam to escape instead of softening the crust. By lunchtime, the pie can be held in one hand, broken in half, and eaten while standing beside a stone wall. The crust holds the entire meal together. Teent number 13. The oatcakes rest quietly in a coat pocket throughout the workday, breaking very little and leaving behind almost no crumbs. In Scranton, in the year 1938, rolled oats, flour, butter, or lard, and salt cost about 10 cents. She pours the oats into a bowl, adds the flour and a pinch of salt, then rubs the fat into the mixture with her fingertips. Water is added a little at a time. She mixes slowly until the dough comes together into a firm mass, then rolls it thin across a tabletop dusted with a layer of white flour. The rounds are cut using the rim of a drinking glass. They are placed onto a hot griddle or a dry skillet, where the aroma of toasted grain gradually rises. Tiny brown spots appear across the surface. The edges become dry, while the center keeps its pleasant chew. Once the oatcakes have cooled, she stacks them into short piles and wraps them tightly in paper. They can be eaten with cheese, pickles, or a slice of cold meat. They aren't as soft as white bread, but they're sturdy enough to stay in a coat pocket for hours without losing their shape. Thick cakes belong with long days. Item number 12. Boiled soy with pickles. A gently simmering pot warms the kitchen on a cold morning. That year, German or Polish-style sausage, pickles, and mustard for one meal cost about 24 cents. She lowers each sausage into the pot, keeping the water at a gentle simmer so the casings won't split. Tiny bubbles cling to the meat before slowly rising to the surface. The aromas of smoke, pepper, and garlic escape with the steam lingering on the window pane. When the sausages are cooked, she lifts them out with tongs, places them on a towel to drain, and lets them cool just enough before wrapping them. The pickles are packed beside them. A streak of mustard rests inside a folded piece of paper or a small tin, waiting to be spread at lunchtime. This meal carries the flavors of families who changed countries, but held on to the seasonings they had always known. The smoky aroma travels through the wrapping paper. Item number 11. Cheese or sous meat sandwich. Every part of the pig is preserved in its proper way. In Scranton in the year 1938, repurposed pork head meat, vinegar, seasoning, and bread for one sandwich cost about 13 cents. The meat is cooked slowly until tender, then she pulls it from the bones while it is still warm. Salt, pepper, vinegar, and spices are mixed in before the mixture is pressed into a mold. After many hours in a cool place, the meat becomes firm, held together by the natural broth that has gelled around every small piece. In the morning, she turns the mold out onto the cutting board. The knife passes through the chilled meat, revealing uneven marbling inside. Thin slices are placed onto bread and pressed just enough to keep the sandwich secure inside its paper wrapping. For the families of Scranton, this is the memory of hog butchering season, of the large kettle, and of hands that knew how to use every bit of food they had. The vinegar preserves an entire season. Scranton leaves behind lunches that are hearty, salty, and durable, carrying traces of many old homelands. When the story reaches the summer of the year 1971, the working family's kitchen needs a different rhythm. The windows will open wider, the fire will burn lower, and sometimes lunch will begin with the sound of a peach can snapping open. Canned peaches, grated carrots, and the lunches that didn't turn on the oven. Toledo, Ohio, 1971. Summer covered the working-class neighborhood in a thick layer of heat. Sunlight lay quite across the front steps, while the air in the kitchen held heat like the walls of a tin box. She took down the recipe box for the third time. The wooden lid brushed lightly against the shelf. One card bore a dried streak of peach syrup. Another carried the pale orange color of carrots. At the bottom of the box was a short note: eggs, relish, bread. She closed the oven door and left the kitchen still. The Toledo dishes did not require a long burning flame. They needed a can opener, a grater, a mixing bowl, and a cool place in the refrigerator. The next 5 dishes belonged to the summer of 1971, when lunch had to make the room feel lighter instead of holding in more heat. Item number 10, cottage cheese with canned peaches. By the time the countertop had warmed in the early morning, lunch began with the sound of a can lid popping free from its metal rim. In Toledo in 1971, cottage cheese, canned peaches, and a few lettuce leaves for one serving cost about 29 cents. She tilted the can, letting the syrup run in a thin stream into a small bowl. Each peach half was lifted with a spoon, its pale golden surface shining beneath the window. The cottage cheese was scooped into a soft mound beside it, the white curds still holding a little of the refrigerator's chill. If any lettuce remained, she spread one leaf across the plate before placing the peaches and cheese on top. Most of the syrup was drained away, so the dish would hold its shape, but enough remained to leave behind a mild, sweet fruit fragrance. The spoon touched the plate with a very small sound. Outside on the porch, cicadas still called in the midday heat. On the table, the cold serving slowed the rhythm of the kitchen. Coolness was also a form of care. Item number 9, carrot and raisin salad sandwich. The carrot from the small backyard garden carried the smell of dry soil, and a trace of coolness still held in its core. That year, carrots, raisins, Miracle Whip, and bread cost a total of about 18 cents. She drew the carrot across the face of the grater. Orange shreds fell into the bowl, soft at the ends but still crisp. The raisins were sprinkled in, dark against the bright layer of carrots. A spoonful of Miracle Whip bound the ingredients together, creating a filling that was moist, sweet, and tangy. She let the bowl rest for a few minutes. The raisins absorbed some of the dressing and gradually softened, while the carrots still gave a faint crunch when the spoon moved through them. The filling was spread on white bread or served beside crackers for a lighter lunch. The dish carried the sweetness of raisins, the freshness of carrots, and just enough richness from the dressing. In the middle of a summer day, it made the lunchbox feel less heavy. Carrots softened the midday heat. Eaten, number 8, fried green tomato sandwich. Before the first frost, the tomatoes that were still green had to be picked from the vine. In Toledo in 1971, green tomatoes, cornmeal, bacon grease, and bread. For this dish cost about 15 cents. She cut the tomatoes into round slices. The knife passed through the firm flesh, revealing small seeds that were still white. Each slice was coated in cornmeal and placed in a pan of hot bacon grease. The sizzling rose quickly, breaking the quiet of the cold dishes that had come before. The cornmeal turned golden around the edges, while the tomato inside kept its bright tartness. She lifted out each slice, waited for the steam to subside, and then placed it between slices of bread. A pinch of salt was sprinkled on top. On some days, she added a thin streak of mayonnaise to keep the crisp coating from feeling too dry. The sandwich was wrapped after the tomatoes had stopped steaming so the bread would remain firm. The smell of the garden and the smell of the frying pan rested beside each other on the same sheet of paper. Summer remained in the tart slice. Number 7, egg salad with sweet pickle relish. The hard-boiled eggs waiting in the enamel bowl made the morning feel less hurried. In Toledo in 1971, eggs, mayonnaise, sweet relish, and bread for one serving cost about 21 cents. She peeled the eggs, letting the white pieces of shell fall into her palm, and then chopped the eggs in the bowl with a fork. The yolks broke into tiny yellow grains and gradually blended into the mayonnaise. The relish was added last, bringing the smell of vinegar and the sweetness of chopped pickles. The fork pressed the mixture against the side of the bowl until the filling was soft, but still retained some texture. She spread it on the bread, gently pressed the two slices together, and wrapped the sandwich before placing it somewhere cold. This dish often appeared in lunchboxes, at picnics, and in church kitchens. The relish made the eggs taste brighter, while the mayonnaise kept the filling soft for many hours. Soft eggs kept midday quiet. Eating number 6, Egg and olive salad sandwich. At the end of the month, one egg had to be divided carefully so it could go farther. 1971, an egg, green olives, mayonnaise, and bread for this dish cost about 23 cents. She chopped the hard-boiled egg, then cut the olives into small pieces. The knife struck the cutting board at a steady rhythm, releasing the salty smell and mild tang of the brined olives. Everything was mixed with mayonnaise until the filling held together. She spread a thin layer of filling across several slices of bread, enough for every portion to contain egg and a few pieces of olive. The sandwiches were cut into 2 triangles and arranged neatly on a plate or inside a lunchbox. The pale green olives appeared among the yellow eggs, giving the familiar dish a distinctive note of flavor. At church lunches and picnic blankets or beside a cold water jug, this dish was always easy to recognize. Olives gave the eggs a voice. Toledo had passed through cold peaches, grated carrots, green tomatoes, and 2 bowls of egg salad. Near the end of the list, the recipe box began to grow heavy again with white fish, field peas, cheese crackers, and a slice of meatloaf left over from Sunday. The final lunches were waiting near the bottom of the box. Fish, fnive peas, and the meals stretched to the end of the week. The same kitchen in Toledo, the year 1971. Grandma has just wrapped the egg salad, arranged the canned peaches on a plate, and wiped a streak of mayonnaise from the edge of the knife. The chilled plate still rests beside the sink, while the recipe box remains open on the table, its recipe cards slightly curled by the summer heat. At the lower shelf sit a few cans of fish, a bowl of breadcrumbs, and a small jar of vinegar. She looks at the cooked whitefish, then pulls the mixing bowl closer. Lunch continues with whatever is already waiting in that kitchen. Number 5. Imitation crab salad sandwich. When crab is too expensive, whitefish learns how to carry the flavor of the sea. Toledo in the year 1971, whitefish, mayonnaise, celery, a little vinegar, and bread for 1 serving cost about 25 cents. She flakes the fish into small pieces with her fingers, letting the white flesh fall gently into the bowl. The celery is finely chopped, giving off a crisp, dry sound beneath the knife. The mayonnaise is stirred in first, followed by a few drops of vinegar to brighten the flavor of the fish. If there's any tartar sauce left in the refrigerator, she adds a small spoonful, just enough for the filling to recall the taste of the sea that many families could rarely afford. The salad is placed in a cool spot so the flavors can mellow, and she spoons the filling onto soft sandwich bread or a small bread roll, pressing it gently so the celery and fish stay neatly inside. The sandwich doesn't try to become real crab. It simply brings something different to lunch with cool fish, creamy dressing, and a gentle crunch in every bite. Whitefish carries the sea. Item number 4. Handmade fish sticks. Before frozen fish sticks filled supermarket freezer cases, many families still cut and breaded their own fish. That year, whitefish, breadcrumbs, eggs, and cooking fat for this dish cost about 28 cents. She places the fish on the cutting board and cuts it into evenly sized strips. Each strip is dipped into beaten egg, then rolled in breadcrumbs until fully coated. As the fish touches the skillet, the crumbs crackle softly and gradually turn golden. The aroma of cooking fish mingles with the scent of toasted breadcrumbs, drifting slowly through the room with its open windows. She places the fish on paper to drain, waiting until the coating has cooled and become firm before wrapping it. The fish sticks fit comfortably in a child's hand, are easy to divide among several lunch boxes, and are just right for a Friday lunch. The breadcrumbs hold the fish together. The Toledo recipes begin with the chill of canned peaches and come to a close with white fish coated in breadcrumbs. Sometimes a kitchen needs nothing more than a small knife, a mixing bowl, a cool place in the refrigerator, and hands that know how to divide every portion carefully. The next recipe cards are already waiting near the bottom of the box, where beans are being spooned into jars, crackers are stacked in a hurry, and a cooled meatloaf waits for the knife to pass through it. In 5EPEAS, stacked crackers, and the carts near the bottom of the box, St. Louis, Missouri, 1968. In this working-class family, the children waited for the school bus, while the adults prepared for shifts that lasted until late afternoon. On weekends, the recipe box often remained open on the table a little longer. The cards near the bottom had softened at the corners, carrying traces of many hurried mornings. One card bore a dried bean stain. The card beside it held a few cracker crumbs in its fold. At the very bottom was a penciled note. "Loaf, use what is left." She read it, then rested her hand on the edge of the box. In that deepest place, recipes gradually became a way to make sure there was still a portion to carry the next day. Number 3. AVP salad with ham. A jar of chilled field peas had once helped farm workers keep their strength through the end of the afternoon. In St. Louis in 1968, field peas, ham scraps, onion, and vinegar for one serving cost about 18 cents. She boiled the peas until they were tender, but still held their shape. The water was drained away, allowing the heat to slowly escape from the enamel bowl. Ham scraps and chopped onion were mixed in while the peas were still slightly warm, and then she poured the vinegar in a thin circle around the side of the bowl. The mixture was spooned into a small jar and sealed with a lid. Over the next few hours, the vinegar soaked into each pea, while the pieces of ham settled at the bottom, releasing a faint smoky smell whenever the spoon reached them. The acidity brightened the cold dish and made the soft peas easier to eat in the middle of a long day. One small jar held a great deal of strength. Number 2. Box-style cheese cracker stacks. In the rush of morning, she assembled lunch as steadily as if she were stacking coins. In 1968, Ritz crackers, American cheese, and a few apple slices cost a total of about 19 cents. She opened the box of crackers, placed each one on wax paper, and cut the cheese into pieces that fit neatly over their surfaces. Apples were sliced thin and arranged beside them to add sweetness and crunch. The small layers were placed in orderly rows before the wrapping paper closed around them, just as the sound of the bus carried down the street. A child's lunchbox was sometimes made from very small details. The cheese fit the cracker, the apple fit the paper, and every portion was measured by sight. Lunch rested in each layer. After the crackers, cheese, and jar of chilled peas, the recipe box held one card remaining at the very bottom. On it were the meat left from Sunday night, 2 slices of white bread, and a thin streak of ketchup. The sounds in the kitchen gradually slowed. The knife was set down. The wax paper opened. The final item was waiting to be wrapped: cold meatloaf slices and Monday lunch. The same kitchen in St. Louis, the year 1968. Grandma stands beside the old table. The recipe box still lies open after the cheese crackers recipe. The room gradually grows quiet. The knife passes through the chilled meatloaf with a soft slicing sound. Wax paper is spread across the table, spurring gently against the wooden surface. Outside, the morning grows brighter, but the kitchen light still hangs low over 2 slices of white bread. Number 1. Cold sliced meatloaf sandwich. Sunday night's meatloaf becomes Monday's lunch. In St. Louis in the year 1968, leftover meatloaf, white bread, and ketchup or relish for one sandwich cost about 24 cents. She takes the meatloaf from the refrigerator, places it on the cutting board, and cuts a slice thick enough to hold its shape. Once chilled, the meat is firmer. The aroma of onion runs deep through every bite. The breadcrumbs keep the meatloaf from falling apart beneath the knife. 2 slices of white bread are laid onto the wax paper. She spreads a thin streak of ketchup, the red resting quietly against the white bread, and places the slice of meatloaf in the center. She presses the sandwich gently with the palm of her hand before folding the wax paper snugly around it. This recipe stands at number 1 because it preserves the most familiar part of a family lunch. Last night's meat is divided into portions, wrapped securely, and sent along with the working man as he steps into a new day. Dinner still goes with him. The final 5 recipes have traveled from whitefish to beans, from cheese crackers to a slice of cold meatloaf. The lid of the lunch pail closes with a snap. The chair is pushed back beneath the table. The softened edges of the wax paper rest neatly around the lunch, and the house has just sent a piece of itself out the door. The can of potted meat opened on a Detroit table to the slice of Spam sizzling in hot fat, from sardine oil soaking into bread to cabbage, tossed with bacon grease. 30 lunches passed through a series of small motions. An egg rested beside a packet of salt. Dried apples softened again in a pot. Cold chicken was rolled, leftover rice crackled in the pan, cheese was paired with pickles, canned peaches sat beside cottage cheese, white fish was coated in breadcrumbs, and then a cold slice of meatloaf was placed on wax paper. Every dish depended on the same kind of resourcefulness. Wrapping securely, dividing evenly, using everything, keeping food cold, reheating it, and knowing what could travel far beyond the kitchen. Those grandmothers read lunch with their eyes and their hands. How soft the bread still was, whether the fat was hot enough, whether the eggs had cooled completely, whether the slice of meatloaf was thick enough to hold its shape. She did not simply prepare lunch. She wrapped the entire afternoon inside it. The roll of wax paper that softened at the edges in Detroit in 1954 now closed around a sandwich in St. Louis in 1968. The card marked "Meatloaf Lunch" returned to the bottom of the box, beside a streak of ketchup and a few cracker crumbs. The lid came down, still leaving one corner of the paper visible. The box was always opened at lunchtime. If your family once had a dish like this, leave its name in the comments. And subscribe to Old American Kitchen so that the next time another card is drawn, you will still have a chair at the table. Some lunches were never written down as recipes because the hands had known them for a long time.